Now, a little while ago, I did a video on World War III, and my personal opinion is that it's going to start with ISIS stealing nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction from inside Pakistan's borders and deploying those. Now, this isn't a very popular stance, it's not a very popular opinion, because people don't like to think of ISIS with nuclear weapons because, to be honest, religious extremists are all nuts, whatever the flavour of their religious extremism. Now, people have asked me exactly why have I come to that opinion in my analysis, and basically if there is going to be a World War III, my opinion is that it's not going to be Russia or China. And so here is an overview of Russia and China's forces compared to the States. So let's start with military personnel. And as you can see, throughout the rest of this I've done the same thing. I've split it into Russia, China and the US. Because after all, it's either going to be Russia or China, everyone thinks is going to be the people that the US will be fighting against in the Third World War. Possibly both. And if it's both, the US, to be honest, has had it. Now, history has shown that in general, it's the countries with the most population that win. So let's have a look. And the things that you're really worried about is people who are fit for service and people who are already active frontline personnel. Now, as you can see, the US, with its involvement in wars, has boosted its frontline personnel up to nearly 1.5 million. However, this is dwarfed by the Chinese. They have nearly double that amount, and the Russians have about half that amount. However, the Russians have a huge number of reserve personnel, 2.5 million, as against the US's 850,000. And the Russian reserve personnel are called up quite a lot, so I would tend to regard those as being active frontline personnel with about a week's worth of preparation, really. Then if we look at armour and artillery, the Russians have more tanks than anyone else. The Chinese have more tanks than the US anyway. And pretty much when it comes to land warfare, Russia, because of its huge area, dominates everyone else. And we can see that from these figures. The Russians are very good at land warfare, they're very prepared for it, and traditionally this has been their big thing. So there's very little chance that the US could catch the Russian bear napping. The Chinese, it's more of an even fight, but they've still got more. Now this is quite telling, because in general when you're talking land warfare like this, you're talking about defence of your country, not attack. Defence. So Russia and China have got a very defensive posture, so you'd expect them to be strong on land warfare. Now we look at the aircraft and we see a totally different thing. Russia, total aircraft 3,082. China, total aircraft 2,788. US, total aircraft 13,683. Well, let me throw a bit of cold water on this 13,683 figure to start with. Most of the US air fleet, to be honest, will never be in the air at the same time. Because they are all very sophisticated, there's an awful lot of problems and they spend an awful lot of time on the ground. I saw some recent figures that said maybe 1 in 6 aircraft would be up on the ground at any one time. So you can drop this down a bit. But we can see in certain disparities. Now look, attack helicopters 114, 122, Russia and China are about the same. US 914. If this is not a country, the US, building itself up for attacking other countries, I don't know what is. Navy again. Now, once again, if you look at coastal defence, then China's got an awful lot of coastal defence craft. It's not surprising, they've got a huge coastline. Russia, most of their coastline isn't navigable due to ice, so they have fewer coastal defence craft. The US, though, they're not worried about defence at all. They have a huge coastline, much like China. 13 coastal defence craft. But if you look at attack aircraft carriers, they're not much use in coastal defence. The US has got 10, China's got 1, Russia's got 1. Oops. Submarines, once again, Russia and China are about the same, 63 and 69 respectively. United States have got 72, so we're all level pegging in the submarine area. But what we do know is that all three of these countries have nuclear submarines, and certainly the Russian and the US, they have nuclear warheads or missiles in these submarines. China, we're not so sure what they've got. And now we come to the big one, nukes. I'm going to forget about megatonnage because it's not really important whether what lands on your city is a 20 kiloton weapon which causes a half a mile wide crater and kills everyone, or a 20 megaton weapon which causes a 2 mile wide crater and kills everyone. The end result is pretty much the same. People are killed. The main thing is that people in shelters are more likely to survive with a smaller weapon. So as you can see, Russia and America are by far the high players here. Now, this is not surprising because of the Cold War. There was never a Cold War with China. China never boosted its nuclear weapons. So as far as we know, it has none deployed. That is to say, there are no weapons that are actually mounted on missiles and stuffed into bombs that are ready to go at a minute's notice. None. And we believe them to have a total of 250 nuclear warheads, but they're quite big ones. Now, in the US, they have the most deployed. This again says something. This says attack. And they have a total of 7,300 now. I left off a number there for some reason. Russia, they've got a total number of nuclear warheads of 8,000. The US, 7,300. Now this says something else again. A higher percentage of US warheads are deployed and ready to go than Russian warheads. Russians may have more warheads in total, but they've got fewer actually deployed and ready to go. So which country would you think is preparing to attack? One would say the US. Now we're going to look at shelters. Now, by shelters I don't mean a little hole in your backyard. I don't mean individual shelters or family shelters. I'm talking about large government built shelters to protect people that live in cities mostly. Russia's got an awful lot of them. They've definitely got greater than 6,000 because they've just announced a shelter building program in Moscow where they're going to build an extra 5,000. So by then they might have 11,000 shelters. So Russia are preparing to be hit. They're not preparing to attack. They're preparing to survive. China. Well, China has greater than practically every medium-sized town or city in China has a shelter. There's greater than 800 of them. Most of them are enormous. Some of them are capable of taking 200,000 people. And I believe in addition to this, the Chinese have an underground tunnel network which they're using to deploy nuclear missiles, and I believe in an emergency that those can also be converted very quickly into civilian shelters. So the Chinese and the Russians are exceptionally well prepared for their citizens to survive a nuclear war. So China and Russia are kind of expecting America to attack. This is obvious. The US, zero civilian shelters. They're not interested in the population surviving. So long as the politicians survive and the command survives, they don't give a damn. So the US is very badly prepared to survive a nuclear war. Now all this tells you something, and this is what it is. So as you can see, if there's one nation that is prepared for attack and not defence, it's the United States. So if there is a nuclear war, the United States is going to be the aggressor. That is to say, if there is a nuclear war with Russia or China. Now, this is even more so because if you look at all of the other aspects of warfare, the United States is positioned in an aggressive stance compared to Russia and China. China is very defensive, Russia is slightly more so. And you can see really when you look at things like the naval coastal defence craft, where the US doesn't exactly have very many of those, despite its huge coastline, and China has loads, you can see exactly what they're expecting. They're not expecting to start a war themselves, these countries. They're expecting the US to start a war. And the US doesn't seem to care about its citizens. Now, why do I say that? The shelter building program. Now, there are no big public nuclear underground shelters in the United States. There's thousands in Russia and thousands more are being built. There's hundreds in China, but they tend to be huge, like 200,000 people shelters. And they're building more as well. So everyone's building shelters apart from the United States. So who do we think is expected to attack and be attacked? Now these figures are all public. They're easily available if you want to search them down. And ISIS doubtless have exactly the same figures. And they will see that the US is incredibly vulnerable to a nuclear attack. If you want to get rid of the Great Satan, whack a few warheads into his cities. This is one of the reasons I think they're heading for Pakistan in droves. And recently, my idea has been sort of confirmed by the fact that there's been a lot of ISIS activity inside Pakistan. People have been killed. An awful lot of school children have been massacred by Muslim extremists recently in Pakistan. So it's certainly hotting up. And the Americans seem to have lost control of their government. I've said this before, but if their government was truly working for them, their government would be building shelters for the people and not just shelters for some corrupt politicians and the leaders. That's quite bad. And we're in the same boat here in the UK, to be honest. There are no shelters for the people. It's madness. It's madness. It would seem that Russia and China value their civilian populations, they look after them, whereas the US and the UK could not give a damn. And this is really why I think that it's unlikely that the Third World War will be nuclear unless it's an outside agency, because the US simply cannot win a nuclear war. Yeah, sure, you might have a few politicians crawling out of shelters, but in other countries, most of the population could possibly survive. They can't win a conventional war because the figures just don't stack up. So the Third World War will come from somewhere totally unexpected, and that's my proposition. So I hope that you've found this useful and informative, and please like, share and subscribe. Thank you very much.